Good morning and most welcome to 1325. We will today look at the Gibbsonian affordances. In this, the very last day of 2022, I would also like to say thanks for everyone listening for the year soon to be gone. It was a pleasure doing these lectures about different philosophers and scientists, and I hope some of it was understandable and appreciated. So a big tack så mycket från Sweden. And now we will start with the lecture. It's called Perceptional Affordances and Relational Perception. Abstract. Ever since Gibson proposed the concept of affordances, ecological psychologists have been arguing about the best way to formalize them. One approach considers them as dispositional, properties of task environments that are perceived via lawful ecological information variables in ambient perceptual arrays. A second approach considers them more broadly as relations in the organism environment system. This expands the spatial and temporal scope of affordances. We stand in many kinds of relations to our physical, but also social and cultural environments. Affordances as relations are therefore offered as an ecological way to explain behaviors in these so-called representation hungry domains. These are perceived via general ecological information. Which allows a wider class of environmental regularities to be informative about the relation. This paper argues that general ecological information cannot serve as perceptual information. It does not come into suitable contact with an organism and thus cannot support the perception of anything. Let alone the relational affordances that depend on it to be psychologically relevant. I will show that the affordances as relations ontology cannot be an ecological solution for explaining representation hungry behavior, and point to an ecological information-based alternative to that. That can. Introduction. Gibson's ecological approach proposes that organisms directly perceive their environment in behaviorally relevant terms. Specifically, that we perceive affordances. The affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes, either for good or ill. An affordance is neither an objective property nor a subjective property, or it is both, if you like. An affordance cuts across the dichotomy of subjective, objective, and helps us to understand its inadequacy. It is equally a fact of the environment and a fact of behavior. It is both physical and psychical, yet neither. An affordance points both ways, to the environment and to the observer. This definition of affordances is notoriously annoying, and it has driven several quite distinct attempts to develop an appropriate ontology for these odd but theoretically crucial entities. Turvey described them as disposition, while Reid treats them as resources. A more recent approach redefines affordances as a broader class of relations that can be defined not only between an organism and its physical environment, but also between the organism and its social, linguistic, and or cultural environments. This approach is motivated in part by concerns over whether the dispositional ontology is the correct one for affordances. Last one from Chimero, 2009. And more recently, by the drive to find perceptual explanations for behaviors other than the perceptual control of action. See Rietveld and Kieverstein, 2014. Gibson also noted the central question for the theory of affordances is not whether they exist and are real, but whether information is available in ambient light for perceiving them. Excuse me. More specifically, it is always possible to describe the physical environment in terms of behaviorally relevant properties. These are only psychologically relevant. However, if they can be perceived, and to do that, they need to create perceptual information. The perception of affordances as dispositions relies on lawful, specifying ecological information variables, specifically the kinematic specification of dynamics. The perception of affordances as dispositions relies on lawful, specifying ecological information variables, specifically the kinematic specification of dynamics. The perception of affordances as relations relies on an expanded notion of what counts as informative relationship in the environment. General ecological information. The very straightforward claim in this paper is that general ecological ecological information cannot support the perception of affordances as relations. In fact, it is not perceptual information at all. Excuse me. This is because the environmental relationships Bruineberg et al. Claim can be informative to an organism cannot by themselves be in any form of contact with the organism. They are all regularities between properties of the environment and not between the environment and the organism. Because the regularities have no connection to the organism, they cannot be informative to the organism. The result is that you cannot perceive these relations. And so these relations are not affordances. The dispositional ontology plus its theory of information that can be in contact with the organism remains the superior framework for the ecological approach. The problems driving the development of relational affordances must be solved at the scale of this information instead. laying out this very basic problem requires a little context, however. So the first part of this paper reviews the basics of the two approaches to affordances and information. I will lay out the basics of the dispositional ontology for affordances and the nature of the lawful ecological information these create. I will then describe the issues people have with this ontology and the fact that the solutions all seem to require access to various relations. I will then lay out the two basic the dispositional ontology remains the best one for formalizing a theory of affordances, because its theory of lawful ecological information can work as perceptual information to an organism. I will end by pointing to what I think is a more promising approach to solving the problems people raise. Uses of lawful ecological information, they create a brief history of affordance ontologies. 1.1 Affordances as dispositions. The first attempt to theorize a theory of affordances. was made by Turvey, Shaw, Reed and Mace, who characterized affordances as dispositional properties of the environment. Dispositions are potentials constituted by presently occurring anchoring properties, but not made actual until in the presence of the right complementary disposition. The classic example is the disposition of salt to dissolve in water. The disposition of salt to dissolve in water is a possibility. Constituted by the fact that some of the material properties of salt are such that when they are in the presence of water, the salt falls apart. Equally, the disposition of water to dissolve salt is a possibility. Constituted by the fact that some of the material properties of salt are such that when they are in the presence of water, the salt falls apart. I think this is the best metaphor ever for affordances. And you need to leave the idea of subjective, objective, perceiver and perceivee, while why not observed, observer. Look beyond that. Don't take it away, don't negate it, but go beyond it. It will become clearer. Equally, the disposition of water to dissolve salt is a possibility. Constituted by some of the material properties of water being such that when they are in the presence of salt, the water pulls the salt apart. As you can see, every disposition has a complementary disposition, and these mutually define each other. In our example, the solvent-relevant properties of salt identify the solute-relevant properties. Of water and vice versa. But dispositions exist independently of whether they ever come in contact with their complement, or even whether the complement actually exists. For example, many things embody a disposition to dissolve. Given the right solvent, but many of those solvents have had to be invested by chemists who, importantly, could only do so because the existing disposition to dissolve defined the required properties of the not yet existing solvent. Turvey and colleagues proposed that the ontology of disposition implemented Gibson's annoying definition of affordances in a way that made affordances real and comprehensible. In this account, dispositional affordances are properties of the environment. Complemented by dispositional affectivities, which are properties of the organism. Lawful ecological information for affordances as dispositions The next part of the theory to be formalized is how affordances as dispositions can be perceived. The analysis proceeds as follows. Properties of the environment, including the organism, and how they change are best described at the level of dynamics. Specifically in units of time, position, and its temporal derivatives. And mass. It is only at this level that we, scientists and organisms alike, can uniquely identify types of tasks or encounters For example, a catchable and uncatchable flyball are both examples of the same kind of event, projectile motion, just with different parameters. And this sameness is only apparent at the level of dynamics. Organisms, therefore, need access to these dynamics in order to successfully complement the task demands. In order to affect the affordances on offer. These environmental dynamics can only contribute to shaping our behavior if we are in some form of contact with them. That contact can be mechanical, that is via the transmission of forces, but actually almost none of the behaviorally relevant dynamical environment is touching us this way. Fortunately, within the dispositional ontology, we are able to make informational contact with some of that environment over there. This contact is made possible by both the organism and the environment. Being embedded in relatively low energy media that is ambient to them both. Dynamical properties of the environment that can lawfully physically interact with these media can then structure them into arrays of lawful ecologically information variables. It's these arrays that fill the gap between the environmental properties and the organism, and are what functions as perceptual information to the organism. These arrays of variables can be fully characterized at the level of kinematics. Time, position, and its derivatives, but not mass. Mass. Formally, within this ontology, lawful ecological information is therefore a kinematic projection of task dynamical properties into perceptual media. Because of the loss of the mass dimension, kinematic information cannot be identical to the dynamical property that caused it. Fortunately, however, within the ecological scope of the laws governing the projection process, these information variables can be specific. This analysis is the kinematic specification of dynamics. And it is the formal basis of the theory of direct perception. Problems with affordances as dispositions Critics of this analysis have identified three potential problems for affordances as dispositions, summarized by Chimero 2009. The first problem is that when the two complementary dispositions are in the presence of each other, and all the necessary conditions are met, that is, the water's temperature allows it to be a liquid. The dispositions must manifest. The salt must dissolve. Turvey 92 notes this explicitly in his analysis of affordances. In the context of skilled action, this implies that when an organism with the appropriate effectivities encounters a complementary affordance, they must successfully effect it. I am capable of successfully climbing stairs, and so whenever I encounter stairs, I should successfully climb them. This, of course, doesn't happen. I can choose not to climb the stairs, or I can try and fail. I only climb the stairs when I am in a stair climbing relation to the stairs. And this requires more than the simple presence of me and some stairs. The second problem is the problem of overlapping minds. If affordances are properties of the environment, then when two people perceive the same affordance, their perceptions and therefore their minds overlap and are no longer private. This seems weird. So the common solution is to recognize that the two observers stand in different relations to the environmental property, removing the overlap. The final issue raised is that if affordances are properties of the current task environment, we can only perceive affordances that are currently present in our task environment. This implies that the perception of dispositional affordances cannot explain successful behavior in representation-hungry domains. Those where we have to organize our behavior with respect to a property that is separated from us by space, time, or abstraction, beyond the ability of lawful ecological information to connect us. If affordances are relations, then we would be able to perceive things that are not adequately present by virtue of their relation to something that is. Only relational affordances, so the argument goes, offer the possibility of feeding representation hunger with perception. I will note at this point that I actually agree that these are all real issues that require a relational account to solve. I will propose below that it is lawful ecological information and not affordances that exists at the scale of the organism-environment relation, and that how it can be used has all the properties required to address the problems. More on this later. Let's now turn to the affordances as relations hypothesis. Affordances as relations. Organisms can stand in many relations to their environments, and the problems noted above all require access to these relations in order to be solved. Ecological psychologists want that access to be perceptual as opposed to representational. And Gibson's big claims was that we perceive affordances. This has therefore motivated several attempts to develop an ontology of affordances as relations. And more recently, a theory of how these could be perceived. Here I will briefly describe the form of the two basic approaches to affordances as relations that have been proposed in the literature, which generally converge but have focused on different aspects of the issues. There are many authors working within these frameworks, but the goal here is to simply identify the essential features of the approaches rather than review the full literature. Chimero, 2009. The prime advocate for affordances as relations has been Chimero, who has laid out the arguments against the dispositional ontology from above and detailed a replacement relational ontology over several papers. And in his book, where he introduces Affordances 2.0, Affordances 2.0 are relations defined at the level of the organism environment system and are also dynamic. Both the organism and environment can change, which changes which relations are possible. Affordances 2.0 are therefore the possible relations a given organism and a given environment can be placed into at a given moment in time. All of which changes over task, developmental and evolutionary timescales. To contrast to the dispositional account, Affordances 2.0 are not properties of the environment, nor of the organism, but rather non-decomposable relations in the organism-environment system. Beyond solving the concerns detailed above, the proposed advantage of this move is that affordances become dynamic. Because they are co-created by the causal interactions of organisms and environments. While many researchers do focus on how organisms change with affordances, they are perceiving and using Chimero claims they assume this process entails moving from using one statically defined affordance to another. His approach is that learning and development entails the organism negotiating a new relational affordance into existence. This connects the notion of affordances to the biological notions such as niche construction, and allows affordances to change as the various relata do. Rietveld and Kieverstein, 2014, the second. The latest theory of affordances as relations actually places the relation at a higher, slightly more abstract level. Rietveld and Kieverstein define affordances as relations between aspects of the socio-material environment. And abilities available in the form of life. A form of life is the set of regular and stable ways as a type of organism has of doing things. Some of these ways are about perception action, because the relevant aspects of the form of life are embodied. For example, humans have hands, not fins, which allows us to reliably interact with the environment in some ways and not in others. Other ways are cultural, and less tied to the action capabilities of the individual. For example, drivers in the UK reliably stay on the left. While drivers in the USA reliably stay on the right, even though both are capable of driving on either side. On this account, affordances are not about any particular individual. They are about groups of individuals who share a form of life and a socio-material environment that offers some but not other opportunities for behavior. They can evolve and change, as with Affordances 2.0, and again, these happen at various timescales. The proposed advantage of the move to relations between forms of life and the extended physical but also social and cultural. Environment is that these affordances can describe online action control. But also more representation-hungry interactions with the environment. Some of the relations organisms can stand in are between things that are present and things that are not. And if you could perceive that relation, then you could perceive the thing that isn't present. Individuals then vary in the level of skill with which they can interact with these relations. And learning is about better coming to grips with a large field of affordances on offer. I think I will continue later. I'm at page 11. I will go into the proposed theory here. Well, this is one of those points where so many things converge. And two converging tendencies is the one from fractality, showing that interaction is the most real, and that the fractality shows for anything to be real, it needs interactivity. And this, of course, makes the fractal numbers more real than the natural and the real ones, because they lead to more interactivity. Those could be said to be on the borderline between subject and object, where all reality is born. This is converging with the theory of affordances. They are neither on the observer side nor on the observed side. They seem to be lingering on in a between zone, and it is only in this between zone anything can become. So you see a convergence here with the why question of Martin Heidegger, a scientific way of showing his mission, what he wanted to show. I think it's elegant, and it's the only criticism possible, because it isn't a criticism against representationalism. It only shows why it fails, not always, but maybe in a minority of cases. But it fails definitely in presenting a functional worldview. And I mentioned before the numbers being real somewhere in a transcendental zone could be the most advanced example when everything goes wrong. And the most real numbers are also the one less usable as affordances. And I say thank you very much, and have a very pleasant afternoon, and a very good new year in advance. Still some hours left.